I'm Dr. Nicholas Fowler, Senior Historian at Cal Berkeley, and I'm here to tell everyone in the audience about Detente. Now, Detente was a period of time in the Cold War between the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Iran hostage crisis, effectively. The major proponents of Detente were more towards the beginning of the Detente period. They were Nixon in the US and Brezhnev in the USSR. There were many efforts to try and keep the peace between the two, yet at the same time, unfortunately, looking in retrospect, we can see a lot of tension raging in the air, even as they try to maintain peace. Now, the first thing I would like to discuss is reasons for USSR Detente sympathy. First of all, the USSR's economy was stagnating at the time, and they needed benefits that would come from being more friendly with capitalist nations such as the United States. In addition, China was highly considering breaking its alliance with the USSR and going over to the more towards the US's side, which would have been a bad thing for a nation even as powerful as the Soviet Union at that time. There was also a huge missile gap we saw between the US and the USSR, where the US had much more firepower than the USSR in certain areas, but more valuable areas. Finally, Russia, just like the United States, did not want global nuclear warfare. Now for some reasons why the US would want Detente. First of all, Kent State. The date is May 4th, 1970. National Guardsmen opened fire on 13 young students, 4 of which were killed, 9 injured, in peaceful protest on the raging war in Vietnam and subsequent invasion into Cambodia by US forces. This is believed to have contributed to the downfall of Nixon and may have been the catalyst for the eventual decline of Detente, but at the time it was a reason to push for Detente. Now, Kent State was not the first instance of internal conflict, violent protest in the United States, because 5 years earlier, in 1965, during the Johnson administration, we would see some of this sort of start in Cal Berkeley. It may not have been quite as bad, though. The protests started as civil rights protests, but eventually, with the escalation of the Cold War, it started being pushed towards nuclear disarmament. Even further, it just became an anti-war protest in general. So we have this little snowball effect at Cal Berkeley. Not only was the Cold War now causing external conflict, but we would see more and more internal conflict on account of protests and violent actions against protests, or even perhaps violent actions in protest. So the conflict is not only across the world, but within our borders as well, and that is a reason why we want to have Detente, and the general American public stop the Cold War. The general American public would want to have Detente. Now you might be asking, what does that have to do with Detente? Isn't that just about the Vietnam War? However, the Vietnam War, no one would want Detente, really, if not for the Vietnam War. Because the Vietnam War was this center point of Detente, really. That was why, in the American mind anyway, that was the thing that led to Detente. Because we have all these protests, all the American animosity spreads everywhere. No one wants this war anymore. Nixon doesn't want this war anymore. And no one wants to keep fighting at this point. On the subject of the Vietnam War, Detente was the period in which Nixon finally decided it was time to back off. This senseless warfare was too brutal. The ethics were drawn into question by both the public, the military, and even the government to a certain extent. Johnson, an already not well-liked president, was questioned for his actions in the Vietnam War. People were paranoid. Nothing about this was a happy time. unlike our successes in World War II, World War I, our successes in almost every other war we've been a part of, Vietnam was the one exception. Saigon fell to the ground in 1975, and that would mark the reuniting of Vietnam, wherein the Socialist Party would take over Vietnam, and the Vietnam War was over. Now on to the thing everybody knows about Nixon, Watergate. Nixon's Watergate scandal, in my eyes and the eyes of some others, marks a decline in the détente period. Some would dispute this, and it is very debatable because there are some points after Watergate, which we'll get into, of people trying, but mostly failing, to enact détente. However, the Watergate scandal was a point where Nixon fell out of office due to a scandal in his little Watergate hotel. He's taken out of office because he is not fit to be in a position of power. At the same time, Brezhnev, the other détente activist of the USSR, his health is deteriorating. So détente, the two big advocates of détente on both sides are falling through. After the annexation of Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford took the presidency, and there isn't much to say about Ford and détente except for the Helsinki Accords, which effectively marked the end of the peace between Russia and the United States, because Russia's end of the deal in the Helsinki Accords was, people met with very skeptical eyes, because it seemed as though some of the points contradicted Russia's previous actions and other points even in the statement. However, after Ford, Carter attempted to enact détente, but failed miserably. None of his policies pushed, especially after Brezhnev is falling through and Gorbachev comes back in. Gorbachev is a very different type of person than Brezhnev, but it's almost as though Carter is trying to approach Gorbachev as though he's Brezhnev. And finally, Reagan takes over. My next point is on some of the interactions between the Reds and the Blues, the US and the USSR during this period of time, because a lot of people, and even myself through the duration of this presentation, will treat it as though it's sunshine and rainbows all the time. However, that isn't always the case. There's a certain level of diplomacy, which we had seen occasionally in the Cold War, but not quite to this extent. However, in that diplomacy, there's a certain level of tension and animosity that should not be there if things want to be accomplished. For example, SALT I, effectively each of the countries getting together and making sure the other one wouldn't annihilate the other with nuclear weapons. And there's also the Helsinki Accords, which I briefly mentioned earlier. The tension there was the reason why détente was unsuccessful in the end, effectively. Additionally, we see a bit of a love triangle amongst China, Russia, and the US. The USSR, as I've expressed before, wanted US and China not to conspire against them. However, the red and the blue, both wanted peace with China. It's almost like China, sort of this almighty, that is what would keep détente. Yet ironically, in the end, it was something that kept tensions in the air through détente. Now, in conclusion, to wrap all of this up, as I've already mentioned before, Brezhnev became ill around the same time that Nixon fell out of office due to Watergate. Right after the two presidencies, following Nixon, Reagan would come into office, the first strong anti-communist in a while, who stuck to his guns, at the same time as Gorbachev coming in, a strong anti-capitalist from the West. Yet these two were would be willing to take action, but that's not what we're talking about today. But that would spell the end of Detente.
Yeah.